This presentation is about major changes taking place in the colonies from about the middle of the 17th century into the late 18th century and moving toward the American Revolution. There was something called salutary neglect. That's an odd phrase. Salutary means a good thing, and it's usually combined with something that's usually not good. So neglect is something that's considered bad usually, but salutary says this neglect is a good kind of neglect. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, there was a lot of prosperity in the colonies, and in the English Civil War between the Puritans and the Anglicans, and between Parliament, led by the Puritans, and the King, who led the Anglicans, there was a civil war, and the Puritans won. Now, with England focused on this civil war, they really didn't pay much attention to the colonies. And in fact, there was no King of England from 1649 to 1660. The leader of the Puritans was Oliver Cromwell. And the Puritans in New England were quite pleased with this. Some of them even went to help fight in the English Civil War. But the larger point is that England was so occupied with events going on in England itself that they didn't pay a lot of attention to the colonies. They neglected them, but in a good way, because this gave the colonies the right to grow economically, which they did, and to develop some of their own self-government, which was a tradition that they really didn't want to give up when it was challenged later on. When they got used to the idea of running the show themselves, they liked it. Now, in 1660, the Commonwealth came to an end, and the monarchy under Charles II, son of the beheaded King Charles I, was restored. And that's called the Restoration in English history of 1660. And now the Anglicans are once again in charge, and they start to act in ways that New England Puritans will not really like very much. So what we have here is a combination of neglect and the freedom that goes with it, and then control after Charles II comes to the throne. And this pattern would create a rebellious attitude among the colonists. When you give someone freedom and then try to take it away, that's worse than never giving that person freedom in the first place. And that's sort of the psychology that was at work here. Now, after Charles II died in 1685, his brother James came to the throne in 1685 and established what was called the Dominion of New England. Now, he got rid of the colonial legislatures in New England, so that tradition of self-government that they had been developing was taken away from them now, and they were not happy about that. He put into office a man named Edmund Andros as governor of this whole area that covered New England. And he was hated in the colonies. What they were doing is taking away a lot of the independence of these New England colonies, like Plymouth, like Massachusetts Bay, like Connecticut, like Rhode Island. And then in 1688, James II was deposed. He was thrown off the throne of England. A lot of this is involved in English history, which we don't need to go into in great detail, but I'll say this. James was a Catholic. And by the way, this is the same James who was the Duke of York, who took control of New York way back in 1664. But James was a Catholic. And not only that, in 1688, his Catholic wife gave birth to a baby boy. And that offered the possibility of a long line of Catholic kings, and the Anglicans in England were simply not about to tolerate that. So with the Glorious Revolution, James II was thrown off the throne, And then shortly after, Andros, on this side of the Atlantic, was arrested and imprisoned by the colonists because without his king, he didn't have a whole lot of power. Now, one of the things that the Glorious Revolution did was to ensure Protestant rule of England. Um, at the same time, William III, who was married to Queen Mary, the oldest daughter of James II, who was a Protestant, uh, was Dutch. And he really didn't have any experience in England, but they were desperate to find somebody else who was somehow connected to the royal family to be King of England. But but Parliament put some strings on his monarchy. They said, okay, we're going to have a Bill of Rights, and we're going to control taxation, and we're going to have religious toleration, allow various religions as long as they're Protestant religions. With Catholics, not so much. But that means Puritanism is allowed, and Quakerism is allowed, and of course Anglicanism is the dominant religion. And they also said that the King of England from this point on must be an Anglican because he is the head of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. In New England, there were a lot of changes that went along with this. Plymouth Colony goes out of business. It was joined to Massachusetts Bay and simply called Massachusetts, and that became a royal colony. It's now controlled by the King of England. The governor of Massachusetts was now appointed in London, not elected by the people in Massachusetts, but appointed on the other side of the ocean. Now, voting for the legislature now required property ownership, not church membership. So they're saying you have to have some money, some property to vote, but we don't care if you're a member of the church. Well, you can imagine how upset the Puritans were at this. They had set up this system in which they would dominate and their religion would be the religion of the colony, but now that was not true anymore. And that forms a big part of the context of the infamous Salem witch trials of 1691 and 92. Let's talk a bit about those witch trials. They weren't limited to the British colonies. And for about 400 years in Europe, there were more than 50,000 people executed for witchcraft. Most of them were women, and most of them, I think it's fair to say, were poor women. Now, in Salem, Massachusetts, the most common person to be executed was also a woman, but she tended to be better off. She was middle-aged or older. She had no husband, so she wasn't under male control. And she tended to be economically independent. If she were a widow, she might have gained control of her deceased husband's property. And the old school Puritans really didn't like this kind of social change. They didn't like women to have that kind of authority, and they were upset generally at what was going on in their land. The English crown was controlling things, and their old dream of a Bible commonwealth, a city on a hill, seemed to be crumbling. Now, this is an interesting map. This tells us something else about the Salem witch trials. The triangles represent the accused, and the squares represented the accusers, those who brought charges of witchcraft against those people represented by the triangles. Now, what this tells us, what you need to know here, is that Ipswich Road was a major trading route, and a lot of the people who lived near Ipswich Road were involved in this new economy, in commerce, in business, in trade. And they were not typically part of the old Puritan establishment, the old Puritan way of looking at things. The accusers lived farther away from Ipswich Road, and they were a great example of those old-time Puritans just getting extremely angry at the changes that they saw going on all around them. And the result was that a good number of people were hanged for witchcraft. Now, there are two movements that I'd like to speak about in the 18th century. One was called the Enlightenment and the other the Great Awakening. In the Enlightenment, there was a great emphasis on reason. The Enlightenment was a movement of philosophers and political thinkers, intellectual leaders, intellectuals in the community. And now this was, of course, very important in Europe, not just in England, but certainly in France. And they emphasized reason. This was sometimes called the Age of Reason. And it went against some of the beliefs of the Puritans. We talked earlier about pre-modern and modern ways to look at the world. The pre-modern would be to say God controlled the events in the natural world. If your barn burned down, for example, if you remember that, that was God telling you that you may not be saved. This was God's punishment. But after the work of the scientific revolution, especially Isaac Newton, who lived in the late 17th century, a group of intellectuals said, wait a minute, you know what explains things like the barns burning down? Science, the weather, meteorology. And they found laws. They said the world is a world of laws, and not a world in which every event is determined by an individual decision of God. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't believe in God. Some did. Some believed in a different kind of God. But the point is, they believed in science and in laws that governed nature, the natural world. They based their belief in Isaac Newton's physics. And this was mostly a movement of elites, of intellectual leaders, of highly educated people. And this is one of the important parts of the background of the American Revolution. Someone like Thomas Jefferson, for example, was very much a figure of the Enlightenment, as were a number of other revolutionary leaders in what became the United States. Now, the Great Awakening was, in some ways, was opposite. It emphasized emotion. To the leaders of the Great Awakening, Puritanism was too intellectual. And this was a kind of charismatic religion, an emotional religion. They would have preaching that would stir people to their souls. And they challenged the established churches. They really didn't support the Congregational church, the old Puritan establishment. They founded new churches, and and they also were very cool toward the idea of predestination. They believed that people could win salvation. Now this, the opposite of the Enlightenment, is a movement against the elites. This is a movement of more common people against the old leaders of the church, both the Puritan and the Anglican church. Now, despite the fact that in some ways these two movements are opposites, they had something very important in common, and that is intellectual independence. We will decide what we think, regardless of what we're told to think by members of any church, for example. And for this reason, both of them are part of the deep background of the American Revolution, part of the sort of changes in the air that helped to make the revolution possible. They're not causes of the revolution exactly, but they're part of the background. It's sort of like fertilizing the soil, watering the soil for what later would become a full-fledged rebellion against Britain. Now, very typical of the Enlightenment was this man, Benjamin Franklin. You probably know of him as one of the leaders of the American Revolution, and he was that. He was also an intellectual, and it's very interesting because he believed in Puritan values. He stood for hard work and thrift, saving your money, and relying on yourself, self-reliance. He wanted prosperity or riches even. And these are things that fit in very well with the old Calvinist idea of the elect, those who were chosen by God to go to heaven, and God would bless them with material prosperity. And Franklin's values, what he said, fit into that very nicely, except that Franklin was not religious at all. He was completely secularized. So this is an example of what we've already talked about called secularization. That means that what was religious is now not religious. Secular means not religious. Franklin was born in Massachusetts, but he didn't like Boston. He didn't like the Puritan-dominated society, so he moved to Philadelphia, where there was a great deal more tolerance. I'll just give you a sense of quotes from Benjamin Franklin. He values work, for example. You see in that first one. He believes in responsibility. Don't brag about something, just do it. Take care of your time. We would call it time management. Be very careful about improving your habits. Work hard. There will be sleeping enough in the grave, so stay awake now and get something done. A good conscience is a continual Christmas. You get gifts from knowing that you've done the right thing. Here's another one. It takes many good deeds to build a good reputation, and only one bad one to lose it. Now, the important thing here is that Benjamin Franklin represents the secularization of Calvinism, of the Puritan idea of the elect, even though he didn't really believe in Puritan theology.